We go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. If you've been watching our Tuesday Talks, and welcome too if you're just new to our Tuesday Talk series here from the Gordon Jewish Community Center. Well, kind of, yes and no. We're not in the building right now, as you can imagine, because of COVID and all circumstances, which is how this whole thing developed anyway. So it's been an awesome outcome of a terrible situation. So today we have a special guest, so I'm excited because this is really a lot of interest to me personally, so I'm excited to learn and hear what Karin has to say. And so I'm going to introduce you. Her name is Karin Calladimos, which she is the cousin of our beloved Demetria Calladimos, which is so exciting because she was our first Tuesday Talk. So I love this. It's not yet full circle because we're not finished, but I love where this is going. So let me tell you about Karin. She is originally from Chicago and has been in Nashville for 20 years. And she is a certified interpreter for the deaf. And she's been interpreting since the late 80s. Initially in K-12 setting, and now in VRS and VRI with some freelance. And she's mostly in theater at TPAC. Oh, so yes, I've seen you many times, and I didn't know that. So because I've gone to TPAC for the last 20 years. Wow, learned something new. Okay, and so, and also she is certified RID/NAD, and she's going to explain all that because when it gets to initials, I get lost, even though she just explained it to me personally. I've already got lost, so she's going to explain it again and to all of you, and she's just going to share with us so much really just insightful and important information about interpreting for the deaf and all that means. So I'm just going to say, take it away, Karin.
Hello, nice to meet everyone, even though I can't see you, so it feels a little weird because I don't know who I'm talking to. But this started because since COVID, I've been sharing a lot through my neighborhood, Edge Hill Association, different things, mostly not related to the deaf people and deaf community and or interpreting. But I came across a documentary recently that was talking about Black Sign Language and versus white American Sign Language. And I knew there was a difference, and I knew that it was more of a dialectical difference, but I also knew that the majority of people know nothing about sign language. A common myth or misconception often is that people think that sign language is universal. So no matter what country you go to, you have the same sign language, and that's not true. American Sign Language is even very different than British Sign Language. And even though we both speak English, the grammar, the signs, everything is very different. Part of that comes from in the 1700s when there was a man, Dr. Mason Cogswell, and his daughter was deaf, Alice Cogswell, and he wanted to get education for her because there was no education in America at that time. So he met a man, a theologian named Thomas Minor Gallaudet, and then sent him to Britain first to find out how to educate deaf children in America, deaf people in America. And he went to Britain, but he was snubbed by the British educator at the time. So he went to France, where they had a school for the deaf in France. And he ended up bringing back Laurent Clerc, who was the first teacher of the deaf in the United States. And they set up a school, which is in Hartford, Connecticut, and still there today, ASD, American School for the Deaf, and started education. And what Edward Minor Gallaudet did was, and Laurent Clerc, was combine LSQ, which is French Sign Language, and the language that deaf people were using indigenously on their own here in the United States, and created American Sign Language. So, and that was the first school for the deaf in the United States. And later, throughout history, especially in the early 1800s, to mid 1800s, they started establishing state schools for the deaf in every state, and progressed obviously as we moved west. But and TSD which is Tennessee School for the Deaf, was established in 1845, and then TSD, Tennessee School for the Deaf Colored School, because of segregation, was established in 1881. So the documentary focuses a lot on why Black Sign Language and American Sign Language are different because of segregation, which is why they were different. And they're not drastically different. You could definitely understand each other, much like if I went to France, I would have a much easier time understanding any deaf people I met than if I went to Britain and met deaf people, because the languages themselves are so totally different. One of the key differences between British and American Sign Language is that they use, for finger spelling, they use two hands instead of one. So their letters are done with two hands instead of just A, B, C, D, E, F. In the mid 1800s, Gallaudet University was established by a land grant initially, and Gallaudet University is the only liberal arts college strictly for deaf people in the United States. And I'm sure you've heard about it, especially in the late 1980s rather. They had a movement called Deaf President Now, because they had always had people that could hear that were president and controlled the university up until the deaf students rebelled, and they had, or it was actually 1990, I believe, or late 80s. Forgot to look up that date. See some other information about education. In 1880, there was a conference called the Conference of Milan, which was a conference of educators throughout the world that decided that using sign language was bad for deaf people. And if they used sign language, they would never learn to speak or hear or read their language. So they came up with an edict that said that oralism was the only way you could educate deaf people at all. Unfortunately, the United States was part of that conference and also adopted that method. So that went on from the late 1800s up until about 1960 is when it started to change. And during that time, prior to that time, most of the educators for the deaf were deaf people. So deaf people had a lot of jobs. They taught the deaf kids in these residential schools. And then they would actually like slap their wrists and tell them that they couldn't sign, and they would promote, especially like hard of hearing kids that could actually speak some, because maybe they lost their language after they lost their ability to hear, rather after they were post-lingually deaf. They already knew English. So it's much easier to speak and or lip read or speech read if you already have had language prior to. Speaking of that, about 90% of deaf children are born to parents that can't hear. So as I'm sure, especially many people that have children know, that having something that's not the norm with your child is difficult to comprehend, and you don't always get accurate information from the medical professionals or from people, because deafness is a low incident disability per se, even though deaf people don't view themselves as disabled. But so they're steered more towards the oralist view, and manual ASL communication is kind of shunned. And unfortunately, it still happens today, but to a much lesser extent than it did in the early 1900s. But deaf schools still flourished, and kids still learn language, and kids still that had deaf parents that knew ASL first taught that to other students. So ASL still continued to flourish, even though it was forbidden educationally. In the 1960s, a man named William Stokey at Gallaudet University did a lot of research and developed a dictionary for ASL, and decided that there were parameters and that it was a language. And he, as a linguist, proved that ASL was an actual language. And that started to change things, not necessarily for the better, but somewhat, because then they started modeling English on the hands. So you would do English word order, and you would have signs that matched those English words. So they would have something called a 2 out of 3 rule. So if it sounded the same, it looked the same, it was spelled the same, then they would have one sign for it. So for example, the word butterfly. A butterfly is a object that flies, but they would compound 2 words and butter, the sign for actual butter, and then like fly. So they would make that the standard word for things. At that same time, there were some laws being passed for educationally, Public Law 94-142 and the Rehab Act, that opened up schools, public education for deaf children, and said that they were entitled to an equal access to education. So mainstreaming came about. So deaf children started going to public schools, often alone, but sometimes in groups, which is my entry into the field and the deaf community, because my high school in Chicago had a large deaf program. There were about 150 deaf students in my school of about 1,600 students. And the freshman lockers were near the deaf kids' hallway. So I started hanging out with the deaf kids and learned sign language that way. So mainstream schools became more prevalent. In Nashville, the high school that it has a mainstream program is Hillsborough High School. And West End Middle School is the middle school for all deaf kids. And Eakin is the school for elementary school. So all deaf kids are grouped in these. What that did was kind of help them socialize more if there was a school that had a large program. But if there was a public school out in some rural area, then they may have been the only deaf kid in that school, and it didn't necessarily help with socialization, nor did it help with language spreading. So I went to this high school. Then I went to a little bit of a community college that also had about 300 deaf kids in that school, and still hung out with them. Then I stopped and did something else, and then came back and thought, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I always liked sign language, so I'll go back to school for that. My teachers encouraged me to go into the interpreter training program, and I did that, and the rest is history. And initially I worked in a K through 12 setting for 13 years, the same school I actually went to, the same high school. And then I moved here, and initially thought I had went back to college and got my bachelor's degree in education and in secondary education, and thought I wanted to do that. And I thought, well, temporarily I'll freelance interpret for a while, and started doing that for what's now called Bridges, which is on Edge Hill Avenue right now, and worked there for a number of years. Then video relay service came about, which is regulated by the FCC, but it's basically doing phone calls all day for deaf people and hearing people. So it could be doctor's appointments, it could be a grandma and her granddaughter, it could be a conversation with a tech issue, you're having, computer problems and you're calling into Microsoft, or you want to pay a bill, or all kinds of things like that. So I do that all day. And I also do video remote interpreting, which is for video relay for VRS, you have to be in two different locations, the hearing person and the deaf person. And then the interpreter is someplace else entirely. For video remote, the deaf person, and it's primarily used in medical settings pre-COVID. So it's a doctor and their patient, and the doctor can hear, or the doctor could be deaf, but one's hearing and one's deaf, and the interpreter's in a separate location interpreting for them via video. Video has helped with the language and the deaf community, because now not only can you have to use an interpreter, but you can use video like Zoom or FaceTime or anything like that to talk with people all over the world, and possibly date, possibly, do whatever. So that's helped spread the language more. What do I have? So the language, what makes ASL a language is based on 5 parameters. And one of those is the hand shape. So this is the letter D, or this is the classifier of 1. So I could be a person walking. Another parameter is movement. So if I'm moving, then it shows that I'm walking. Another parameter is having 2 hands. So I could go socks. It has 2 hands, and that all makes that sign. But if I change the direction, the palm orientation, and make it up, then that word is stars. And then there's non-manual markers, which is your facial expression and your mouth movements for what you do, which don't necessarily match English. Deaf people, as with any language or any group, are not a monolith thing, and they're a variety. So some people are hard of hearing, and they rely more on lip reading or speech, or have a cochlear implant, or use hearing aids. There are people that are deaf. As I said earlier, 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So ASL is typically not their first language. They may not have any language, unfortunately, until they start school, which is typically at 3 if you're deaf, when they do a hearing test when you're first born, and then they'll place you into that program, or that type of program. But 10% are born to deaf parents. So they have language, their first language is sign language. And children usually typically sign at a much earlier age than they speak. So they can sign their first word, which is typically like mom or milk or eat or more or something like that. And it definitely doesn't have the fine motor dexterity that, an adult would have, but the parents know what that word is, and the child will typically sign around 5 or 6 months when they say their first word. So let's see, what else? Another interesting tidbit to my the first interpreters, really, there were always interpreters, but the first interpreters were typically social workers, people within a religious group, and teachers, most of them. And the interpreting profession has evolved over the years, as a lot of professions, but mostly because it came from like those groups. It was more of a helper model, or their children would interpret for them. They also interpreted consecutively. So you would say something and I would just sit there and listen to it, and then would turn and interpret what that was into the other language, whether it be English or American Sign Language, which is actually more accurate than doing it simultaneous, which is what you see on TV when they're doing the political stuff or the weather stuff. They're doing simultaneous interpreting. Which we can do that because you're obviously not conflicting languages and conflicting modalities as far as like speaking and signing. This is quiet and this is auditory, so it doesn't necessarily conflict. But initially during the Nuremberg trials, spoken language interpreters would use consecutive interpreting too, but during the Nuremberg trials, because they had so many trials to do and so much interpreting that they had to do, and they had to do it quickly, plus there was technology of tape recorders and headsets and that stuff that had come out, they switched to a more simultaneous form of communication. So like interpreters at the UN or interpreters for dignitaries or stuff usually use simultaneous communication now, spoken language interpreters versus consecutive. Let's see what else. There's, as with any language and any culture, art is a significant portion of what they do. So there's this genre of art that's called devia, which is DE apostrophe VIA, and the VIA are capital and the DE are lowercase. And it's deaf view image art, and it shows primarily art that relates to the oppression they feel. It's or more emphasis on the hands and less emphasis on the ears, unless it's shown to connotate the oppression that they face. And I do have links which I will send to you later, so you can add those on Devia, and also on the documentary that started my whole invitation to speak. And I'll provide those later so they can add them. That's it, unless any questions.
I don't know that. Hi, I'm back. I don't know if we have any questions right now. If there aren't from our audience right now, but I have a lot of questions. It's fascinating to me. Just the whole the evolvement of sign language, which I never even stopped to think about it. I always thought it was just one thing, and so, and of course it would make sense that different languages would be different sign languages. I was just thinking when you were talking about that, how my son, he still studies, but he lived in Japan. He speaks Japanese, and he told me in the Japanese language itself, there are so many different forms of speaking that you have to know, like when you speak to an elder, when you speak in a restaurant, there are so many, just in regular language, don't use the same words or, pronouns, things, just a whole actually kind of like, just an effect of speaking to somebody. You have to consider all these things. And so I was thinking of that when you were talking about the different sign languages, how it goes with different languages. And I was thinking, oh my God, in Japanese, it would be so interesting in just knowing you have to use different ways of speaking in Japanese to people. How would that even be interpreted? You have to start, like, you think differently, you have to think differently, language, in different circumstances.
Which is similar to interpreting, because you're not just interpreting the words, you're also interpreting the implicit and explicit information, and also adapting that to the affect of the speaker. So, or their age, or, their if they're angry, if they're happy, or if they don't know what they're asking, or that kind of thing.
And you also brought up, which it's Black History Month, and so I would love to, if you could just maybe go into a little more detail, the differences. And I mean, it seems to just also hinge on civil rights, that it came later. It's a whole, thing that whole talk in itself, but just what if there are, you said there weren't that many differences, but what would be the differences that there would be?
Well, Black deaf American Sign Language use more two-handed signs. So for example, they would do, you could just sign finish, but they would do finish. Always, their signs are higher on the forehead, whereas white people have tended to drop them down. So like this is no, but as in I know something. But Black deaf tend to put it higher up on the forehead. And it's really more of the older formal language is what they've maintained versus.
And that was originally from France, you said? That was over here, so it's more of a French type of interpretation?
Right.
So
for example, I mean, I don't know the word in French, but this is 100 as far as like $100, and it's a C handshake, which is another connotation that people think that the signs all are iconic and they look like what they are when they're not. So this C represents the word for 100 in French, but it's the C handshake.
Boy, it's I just find I've always like wondered how, like as a speaking person, you know, how this even originated, how they even formed this expression and were able to kind of take language itself and put it into like little, you know, into gestures, and how they decided that. And it was interesting too when you said how they keep changing it, which must be exhausting for people to have to keep learning like what's happening here, because if you're changing but like a butterfly, like actual butter and fly.
Well, those were invented more like a code, not a language.
Oh, okay.
That butterfly example was a code. The oralist philosophy viewed it more as, well, they'll learn English better if they learn a better representation of English. So they took English and put it on the hands and initialized everything so that it was an initialized English on the hands.
Right.
It didn't really make any sense whatsoever, but it was pretty common for about 20 years, their effort to kind of going from oralism to going, okay, well, oralism didn't work so well with educating deaf kids. Okay, we'll try English on the hands codes and that'll help educate deaf kids, but that didn't help. You know, just like when you learn English, you don't think of words in, you know, this is what it looks like. A word just doesn't, you know, look like something. So they were trying to take the word and make it visual, but that's not what language is.
I almost wonder if like a person who is deaf would really be, when they teach it, like it's because they're coming from a whole different place of living it, you know, all the time.
Right.
So and they would, I feel like, would best understand how to communicate best as a deaf person. So it almost seems like it would make sense for them to have developed, you know, a deaf person to have developed what is the best way to communicate, you know, language.
Right, which was part of the problem with going to oralism is, you know, most of the teachers of the deaf were deaf themselves. So they knew language, they had fluency, they had, you know, education, and were able to convey that to somebody. But then after oralism, the Conference of Milan, then it became a long history of hearing people that didn't know those subtleties of language.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking how language is such an amazing, you know, in itself, because one of the reasons I love traveling, and I always think, of course, it's great to learn at least basic words and be respectful of people's languages and cultures and all of that, to go in and not just be like, you know, you have to learn mine or all that thing. But beyond all that, the thing I love about traveling in foreign countries when I don't know the language is realizing ways to communicate without words. And I realized,
Uh-huh.
I mean, sometimes it's incredibly frustrating and it's almost like, oh my God, like I remember once when I was traveling through China and I went off from the group by myself, and all of a sudden I was really, I mean, there's no semblance of language to understand on signs, when it's all in Chinese. I'm like, oh my God.
Uh-huh.
Really then start to rely on different means of communication.
Mm-hmm.
I just find it actually, I feel like my mind opens up in ways that I just don't, my everything, my visual, everything becomes more heightened and more,
Mm-hmm.
everything's more alert. And so I just was thinking about that when to try to put myself in somebody's shoes who does not hear, you know, all these other senses are so much in play, and there's so many
Mm-hmm.
ways to also communicate that we just take for granted. Speaking people just take for granted, when you can hear
Uh-huh.
communicating. So it's fascinating to me when somebody can't see or somebody can't hear things, their experience of life is from such a different place. And then being the interpreter, you're kind of interpreting somebody's way of experiencing something. So that must have to, like, that's an interesting place to be as well, from your perspective.
Yes, definitely. And part of the code of ethics, our code of professional conduct, is to match the affect of the speaker. So,
Like you were saying before, the emotion,
right, the emotion,
the intention.
right, even if it's implicit, but I know that it's, implicit. I need to express that they're trying to tell you something.
Right, yeah. So, and then I was thinking when you were speaking, how the world of technology must be like amazing, such like a gift now, because
Mm-hmm.
people can Zoom and they can communicate with
Right.
their hands. And I mean, like it's amazing when you think what people had to do before this
Mm-hmm.
to now. I'm wondering, like, I don't know. I don't have any deaf people in my life, and I've never really dove into that world. So and it seems like you grew up with friends and you seem to have really
Mm-hmm.
that world. I know this sounds basic and maybe almost, and it's not, maybe I'm ignorant, so forgive me, but like even when a deaf person is driving, when you're in a situation where sound is definitely is important part of the process, like more than at other times. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to for safety reasons, like
Mm-hmm.
what are the compensations and things like that?
Well, nobody is necessarily 100% deaf too. So, I mean, if somebody that can hear is blasting their radio, they're not necessarily going to hear what's going on out there either.
That's
um,
the matter
but
of
there's various degrees of hearing loss too. So,
right.
but that is one of the reasons the fraternal, it was basically an insurance company that was run by deaf people because they couldn't get auto insurance. So they started this fraternal organization that's was social, but and advocacy, but also to provide insurance to deaf people because they wouldn't give deaf people insurance.
Right. There's these basic things we take for granted, all this stuff.
And
And
some there's truck drivers that are deaf, and a lot of states have rules that you can't drive a truck if you're deaf. So
wow.
they have, and to do that, if they live in a state where there's a law that says they can't, then they have to jump through lots of hoops, or even if the state does allow it, they still have to jump through additional steps. But I'll interpret calls for truck drivers calling in to deliver loads or having a problem or taking a break or stuff. So,
And then you would do that through visual. You would do that like on
right,
Zoom.
through
Everything.
VRS, through video relay.
Right. Wow. That's such a great gift, though. I mean, to think that now technology, how helpful it is. It's like game changing,
Mm-hmm.
life
Yeah,
changing, so many levels. And then
yeah.
you were speaking about infants. That also fascinated me because to think that at what'd you say, 3 to 5 months, a child can already like if they were.
Find a word. Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh. So is there, so if a parent who has a deaf child, they know this now. That's because it's a fact that the child can communicate if they're taught. So are parents now becoming more,
if they're steered in the right direction, but there's still a strong bias and a strong view that they're broken. And so you need to fix it, fix their hearing, and the parents, they may have never met a deaf person before. They don't know what's out there. They don't know any of this stuff. So they meet a medical professional that gears them towards that way. And then language is really important. You really need to learn it early in life. So in some countries like Sweden, they have deaf people come in and move in with the family for like the first year.
Wow, that's
of
amazing.
the deaf child's life. So
wow, that's incredible. There's so much more ways to expand our compassion and, appreciation of others who are, not like ourselves, and to deal with them in a more, to deal with situations and people in just such a more holistic way than, a kind of like this kind of arrogant, like I know what's best for you way, instead of putting yourself in their shoes and then figuring out from there what would be,
right.
more encompassing way of learning and being and stuff. So all these things I just I never really thought of. And then also, so you're in TPAC, which is also fascinating, being in theater. And
I love TPAC.
Yeah, because I'm always drawn to watching. It's like a performance in a way in itself, when you, especially when they're interpreting music, and stuff. So, and in the theater, because there's so much going on so quickly. You were talking about spontaneity, how do you even they're having conversations and the music is playing, and
a lot of rehearsal. A lot of rehearsal, both before the show even opens, and buying the soundtrack and listening to that and working with your team, and then going to at least 3 or 4 of the performances, sitting in the sound booth, watching, practicing.
So there must be different levels you get to in your own, as anything anybody does, as they grow in their, knowledge of something, they get more authentic, it's better, and you start to understand what's more important to interpret at this moment, or how to do it. You become like a unique interpreter. Is that the right?
That's okay.
I can't speak English, but here we go. Interpreter. Hello, interpreter. I make up words. What word did I make up yesterday here? Oh. It was snowing here in Nashville. Hello, world, whoever's watching that might not be in Nashville. And yesterday I said to my son, "What's the windshield factor?" Mom. So anyway, language. I love language. I love learning languages. My son actually speaks. He loves learning more than me, but he speaks a few languages. But I've always loved language in itself. And so to be an interpreter of language, so you specialize, I would imagine, or I'm not asking you, in English, or do you have other languages? Like do you have a specialty, or do you have a few languages, or?
I just know American Sign Language and English. Those are the only 2 I know. But there are what's called trilingual interpreters, and mostly into Spanish or Mexican Sign Language. Same thing with Mexican Sign Language. All Spanish-speaking countries are not all the same. They have different languages. But and just an aside from that, American Sign Language is also used in a lot of other countries, like in African countries, mostly because of the missionaries going there and educating for all of that encompasses. Canada uses both LSQ and American Sign Language, so the English-speaking part of Canada uses that. But a trilingual interpreter will will like somebody that speaks Spanish, and they can hear and they speak Spanish, and the deaf person knows American Sign Language. So the trilingual interpreter will use ASL this way, but speak and listen in Spanish.
Wow. That's a whole other level.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So many different ways, and that's something else that I never even considered until this conversation about the different ways. If somebody's interested in to become an interpreter, I said it right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You could take it. One could take it so many different directions.
Right. And in various settings, like I said, I like doing theater. Freelance is more where you're going to the place. Educational settings, post-secondary, offices, work, folk rehab, medical, a multitude of settings that you could work in. And then VRI and VRS.
How long would you say it would take somebody just to learn basic sign language, to be able to converse with a person, who is deaf, or uses that as their main form of communication? How long do you think it would take to be kind of efficient in it, to really be able to have a conversation?
It depends on your ability to learn languages. In part, if you know another language already, it's probably easier because you don't have the mindset of this sign equals this word kind of thing.
But I mean, just English, if just English being your main language, and somebody wants to learn how to do sign language, how long would it take, do you think?
I've read that it can take 5 years, but again, it depends on your ability to learn language. It also depends upon, you really need to involve yourself in the deaf community. So if you associate and go to events that have the deaf community are at, you'll learn much faster than if you just go take a class. Right.
That's always the case, isn't it, though?
Uh-huh.
Throw yourself into the fire.
Right.
So you, and like you said, you already had friends in high school. So you were already kind of, your natural interest started right then, then.
Right.
Had a heads up, and then you went to a college. Does every college offer this? I mean, or is it just a few colleges?
It's just a few colleges. The community college that I went to initially right after high school, they had one sign language class. That was it. And I took that. But I was a member of the Collegiate Association of the Deaf chapter at that college because they had so many deaf kids. I'm older, so a lot of it, there was a rubella epidemic in the 60s.
Oh, I remember
that caused deafness. So there was a big spike in deaf kids during that time. So my age group, there was a lot of deaf kids. So when I went through school, there was more deaf kids, especially since I went to the school that had a mainstream program. But so I only took one sign language class, but it was hanging out with the deaf kids and going to events. And at that time it was we'd have movie night. So they'd have a projector and the movie was super, super loud, and, little theater things, and bowling's very big in the deaf community.
Interesting. What would you say, we're going to wrap it up soon. And I just would be interested to know, what has been, or have you had any really like outstanding experiences, or things that would just really have stayed with you, like through your life of being an interpreter? Any outstanding experiences, or like, just anything that stands out to you in your experiences?
There's a variety of experiences that stand with me. One of them was early in K-12, because when I interpreted in a K-12 setting, was just interpreting for kids talking to each other, the deaf kid and the hearing kid, and them forgetting that there's an interpreter there, and you're still there, but they just kind of forget it. I interpreted football, and there were two kids that started on the football team and all 4 years. So I interpreted the football. So just being part of that whole culture that I wouldn't normally be part of, which was nice. Recently, I did a call where the person didn't, American Sign Language was not her first language. She was, and it was done through VRI, but she spoke another language, and I can't remember what language it was, but just the ability for her to get her needs met and the doctor to get his needs met, and just making that all work in a positive way was,
right. That's profound. You're in situations that are really, it's so important to people. Right? I mean, these are like medical situations, things like, well, everything's important, really.
The worst is the situations that stick with me in a negative way, though, are for video relay, it's scam calls, and you have to, I mean, that's the communication, and I can't like delete it or hang up or tell them it's a scam call, and just going through that whole thing, and it makes you feel awful if they fall for it.
Oh my gosh. Wow. I didn't even think about that. Wow. So you said that you had some links that I imagine we will share. And Alex, I'm not sure if Alex is still there, but she'll share them with our listeners so that they can. It's a video, right? That
one is the documentary on, and it's only at 30 minutes, so it's not a really long documentary on American Black Deaf. And then the other one is just a website that shows Devia art.
Oh, okay, great. I've so enjoyed today's conversation. It just really opened my mind to so many things that I just really don't focus on, and it was so informative. Really appreciate speaking with you today.
Thank you. I was so excited when.
Yeah. If people want to get in touch with you for your services, how would they reach you? What's the best?
My info, I will include it. I will include the information. I don't have a website or anything, but
okay, that's
my phone number.
We can always connect you with any of our listeners through Alex or whatever. We will make sure to have people, if anybody needs your services, to be able to find you. And I imagine you're registered